Hey guys, and welcome to today's video, and we're going to be talking all about a podcast with the incredibly inventive name podcast, and why everyone that considers themselves to be a Counter-Strike aficionado should go back and watch it. So wasting no time, let's get into it. What is podcast? So in the name, this was a podcast that ran essentially from day one in CSGO, and day one in CSGO, at least competitively, was towards the end of 2012. It was sort of in, I think it was the October into November sort of time. This period of the year going into 2013, these were when the first CSGO tournaments were being played. This is when the scene was starting to establish itself. And this podcast ran right up until, I think the last episode was just after EMS 1 Katowice 2014. This was the first major of 2014. So the show itself mainly focused on the top scene, the top players, the events, and all the storylines surrounding these sort of things. So sort of talking about expectations going into event, reflecting on events, a bit of analysis, this sort of thing. And those of you that are familiar with Thorin's content these days, it was much like that. He talked about concepts around the day, massive hypotheticals, these sorts of things. I'm sure you all love him for. So on this show, there were 3 regular co-hosts, and the first of these was Thorin, as we just mentioned, and I'm sure everyone watching this now has heard of him. The second co-host was lurppis, who I'm sure most of you have probably heard of. But just to talk about lurppis, in 1.6 he was an in-game leader. He, at the start of his career, he led some Finnish teams. Can't remember the exact names of the Finnish teams, but he used to play with his brother Narsu. Narsu was another player. I think Ruiz was another player he used to play with, these sorts of people. And then he moved over to America to be the in-game leader for Complexity, and most notably, at least these days, most notably you'll know him, he used to in-game lead for a team with nothing on it. So then coming into CSGO, the end of 1.6, he took a step back. He moved away from the scene. He went off to pursue his career, I think, in investment banking. But in CSGO, he came back. He dabbled in a bit of analysis. He still does from time to time these days. But now, what he does now is I think his title is VP for Finance at Immortals. And of course, MIBR is under that Immortals banner. So I'm sure he works at least some capacity, probably very loose capacity, at least some capacity he'll work with current MIBR team. And the third co-host was cArn, who I suspect less of you, probably most of you have probably heard of cArn, but less of you certainly than the other two would have heard of cArn out of these 3. So cArn was a legendary 1.6 in-game leader. He was the in-game leader for Fnatic from 2006 until 2012. Most notably during this period, he was the in-game leader for Fnatic in 2009 with Gux, with Get Right, with Forest. All of these players, and this by many is considered one of the greatest teams to ever grace Counter-Strike in any of its versions. And cArn was actually replaced on Fnatic by Exist, who we'll talk about in the middle, for all his biases towards Exist and how hilarious they are. So at the start of CSGO, cArn took a step back. He started working with the organisation of Fnatic. I don't know his exact role, but at least during this period when the podcast was being filmed, he certainly, you can tell he had a say over the rosters that Fnatic had. And nowadays in Fnatic, I'm not really sure the exact role he does, but he seems to work with the players. He works in multiple games. He's certainly not as involved these days with the Fnatic Counter-Strike team as he was back during when these podcasts were recorded. So moving along, why should you watch podcasts? And the biggest reason here is because, in my opinion, this podcast is the best way to learn about Counter-Strike in those early days, from late 2012 and especially from late 2012 going into 2013, this sort of period. So if you've ever actually tried to go back and watch games from this sort of period of time, I think it was at the major at DreamHack Winter 14, they brought in a patch to the spectator client to GoTV to make it much more bearable. But I'm telling you, before this patch came in, it was absolutely horrendous watching live games, demos, whether it be demos or casted games. It was absolutely awful because it would stutter all over the place. I think there used to be a glitch where every time someone got a kill, it would freeze or something, so you could watch people. And then just before, when it started freezing, you knew the guy was going to kill the other player. it just basically ruined the whole experience. It was just absolutely horrific to watch games. So certainly listening to this podcast, listening to them talk about the games is a much less painless and definitely much less time-consuming way to kind of become more knowledgeable about this period. So as always, context is king, and this what this podcast is so great for, is providing context to these games during this period of time where there wasn't anywhere near as much coverage as there is these days from content creators. During this time, commentary was in its infancy. The commentators were not as experienced. They didn't know as much about the game. They didn't know the storylines. They couldn't kind of explain the storylines. They couldn't talk about coming into this game, what do we expect from these players, what do we expect from these teams, what do we expect from these styles, what are the storylines from coming in from different lineups, all these sort of things, which they're much better at these days, and kind of going into the game, bracing the viewer for what to expect, what the storylines to look out for. And during this period, at least going into, I think the first analysis desks were at DreamHack Winter 2013, the major DreamHack Winter 2013. But before then, there were no, at least I can't remember, there were no analysis desks, at least in the style that you think of today. You have proper analysts, you have proper segments, talk about the beta, all these sort of things. So you didn't have as much context about the teams, about the players, about the storylines coming into games as you do these days. And this show, in my eyes, is so good at filling that void. So let's talk about some of those big overarching storylines that they cover in these episodes of podcasts. So the really big storyline actually that they talked about, I think probably over the first 5 or so episodes, a big storyline they were always talking about is this idea of the source players versus the 1.6 players coming into CSGO. So you might not think about it these days, because certainly these days this discussion of these two groups battling against each other is definitely petered out. But during this time, this was basically the entire discussion of the community was about the CS 1.6 players versus the source players, who was coming in, who had the advantage coming into the game. So during this period, what actually happened was that for the most part, it was actually the source players who had the advantage, and they sort of theorized that perhaps because the source's mechanics are closer to CSGO's mechanics, perhaps the individual players ported over more of their knowledge over, perhaps the tactical knowledge of how source worked ported over better in CSGO, and this sort of thing. So the notable teams that came from source, who had loads of source players, was Very Games, the French team, Distance, RPK, then Scream replaced him, Kenny S during the early days. Who else would we have? Smiths, of course. I'm sure I'm forgetting someone. MBK. These players that I'm sure you've all heard of. These days they were played in Very Games, at least for the first half of 2013 until Shox came in. Shox replaced Kenny S. Then they became the best team in the world. But anyway, during these early days, they were one of the best teams in the world, and they came from Source. And the other one were the Danish teams: Copenhagen Wolves, Western Wolves, Glaive, MSL, Pimp. Some of the Astralis guys, probably Device. I know he's in and out of the game at this stage. Dupree, probably Zipnix as well. Oh no, Zipnix was on the Fnatic. Whatever, it doesn't really matter. Most of the Danish players you know these days, at least a lot of them were. A lot of the older Danish players were playing at this period of time, and they were in some of the best teams in the world, at least during this period. So the other big storyline was NIP, and NIP, especially coming into the game, had a lot of this talk about 1.6 versus Source. NIP actually, when they first constructed the team, they took 2 Source players coming into the game. For Flaren and Freiburg were Source players, and the other 3, Exist, Forest, Get Right, were 1.6 players. So there was all people theorizing perhaps the best thing to do is actually mix 1.6 and Source players, have the best of both worlds. Perhaps that's what gives NIP their advantage in CSGO. Of course, NIP went on the 87-0 run at the start of CSGO. These are offline games, 87 offline maps won in a row from the start of the game until, what would it be, something like May or April of 2013. So this is a stat that's recited even these days in discussions about the best team ever, these sort of things, greatest runs ever, this sort of thing. But a lot of people don't know the context around this run. What was the scene about? What was their competition like? And this, again, the podcast is so good for learning the context around NIP's run here. So you'll learn that a lot of the big guns coming into the game that people expect to be contesting for titles, the 2 of the big teams were ESC, at least. I think they're ESC at this time, but this was the Golden 5 minus been Lord, whoever Pasha replaced, but this was the Polish players who went on, at least the core of them went on to become VP. the VP that you all know and love up until whenever the lineup started falling apart in 2018. And the other team was Na'Vi, who'd stayed as the same 5 players. I think it was probably since 2010 when they had their all-major winning running year all the way into CSGO. So coming into CSGO, these two teams were 2 of the absolute best teams in 1.6. A lot of people had a lot of hype about these teams. These teams both fell completely flat coming into CSGO. They never really got close to what people were expecting for them. And this is some really great context about NIP's 87-0 run, because they had teams like these two that refused to make changes because they had some success with their team in previous games. They were so reluctant to make changes. They sat it out for 6, 8, whatever months before they actually committed to making a change. And this is something you have to keep in mind with this sort of run of how the scene was nowhere near as competitive and people were not actually transitioning in CSGO as they had expected. All these sort of things. There was so much context behind them actually getting this 87-0 run that you can learn about in this show. And the other reason you should definitely watch this show is because it's absolutely hilarious. The trio of Thorin, lurppis, and cArn play off each other so well. They're obviously such good friends for a number of years. You can tell on this show the way they banter with each other, the chemistry they have. It's really, really funny. So most of the humour on this show tended to be lurppis and Thorin kind of jabbing, and the other way as well, at cArn. And this is because cArn, at least during this period, had some really clear biases when he talks about players. As I mentioned before, Exist was the player that replaced him on Fnatic. And when they were always having discussions about who is the best in-game leader at the start of CSGO, the discussion was really kind of Exist against sort of Glaive, Existence, these sort of other in-game leaders. And Thorin and lurppis always took the angle that Exist might be a really great fragging in-game leader, but perhaps Existence, Glaive, these sort of people, they were better tactical in-game leaders. But cArn would always come back and say, no, Exist, he's such a great mind, he's such a great player, he's really the perfect in-game leader. They had massive rows about this sort of thing, and it's really, really funny. And the other thing is that because cArn was working for Fnatic, he'd always have to predict, but always would predict Fnatic to win series no matter what the odds. There'd be games that they'd be playing NIP, and they were such massive underdogs, and cArn would just have to predict Fnatic to win these games when obviously they didn't stand a single chance. So cArn and Thorin in particular, during these shows, they had such massive debates. If you didn't know that they were friends, you definitely think they were on the verge of arguing, but I'm telling you, they are absolutely hilarious. And one that comes to mind was the Prague Challenge in 2013. So Thorin actually casted this event with Anders. And at this event, it was won by a mixed team. It was called Nostalgia, and this team had on it Neo, Taz, Apex, and Kenny S. And a player you've probably never heard of called Overdrive, who it was an absolutely terrible player at this point in time. And it seems, at least from what I know, that it was sort of his brainchild to bring all these players together to play in this mixed team. But they actually won. They won this tournament, beating Na'Vi, who at this point were probably top 5 sort of team in the world, at least be considered by most people as a strong team. But they won this tournament. And I remember Thorin and cArn were having this massive debate. Why Thorin was going at the angle of, this is an unbelievable upset. This would never have happened in 1.6. You never have a mixed team beating an actual top team, at least a top 5 sort of team in the world. And then cArn was coming at the other angle, saying it's possible. Pistol round, a couple gun rounds, you can win a game. It is possible in Counter-Strike. There's enough kind of randomness in the game that this is possible. I had this massive debate. It's absolutely hilarious, and you definitely go back and watch it. And another hilarious skit I remember, they were talking about this concept of how should we get more and more players into CSGO, because at this game it wasn't very big. And they're saying perhaps we should just make CSGO free to play. So they start playing with these ideas. How would CS free to play work? And they decide we need, for Valve to make the free to play model work, they need something to monetize in the game. Now, this is before skins, and of course these days skins would definitely have been the way to go to monetize CSGO. But at this point they were theorizing these ideas of how should we monetize CSGO. And what they came up with is perhaps, they were obviously joking, half joking when they were saying this, perhaps Valve could have the option to pay extra for really good guns to be used in the game. And the idea they came up with is maybe you could buy a bazooka to use in the game. And they talk about this hilarious kind of skit sort of thing when someone was just playing CT Dust 2 and they run across mid and they get bazookaed down mid, and he looks to his friend like, what on earth was that? What was that killed me? And his friend just says, oh, didn't you know that guy's dad is rich? He can afford the bazooka. And these sort of hilarious things would happen all the time in this show. You should definitely go back and watch it. So to summarize, you should definitely watch it. I'll link it in the description, and just a warning for you guys. The first few episodes, the production value isn't particularly great. I remember Thorin's mic in particular was pretty terrible, so at least from there it gets much better. It gets much better as you go, probably episode 3, 4 onwards. It seems it gets a lot better in terms of production value and kind of quality of watching this sort of thing. But anyway, I think that's everything for this video. You definitely go back and watch podcasts. It is really great. But thanks to everyone for watching this one. Why don't you subscribe, like the video, follow me on Twitter, all the good stuff. And I'll catch you guys in the next one.